Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for November 12th, 2021. I want to begin with a quick update on what the Warhawks are up to because they're renewing the escalation for confrontation with Russia. And this is something we'll be discussing at the Schiller Institute conference this weekend, starting tomorrow morning, Saturday morning, November 13th at 10 a.m. In fact, the first panel is on Russia and China relationships with the United States. But let's just review the escalation that's underway, starting with what's happening with the Polish-Belarus border. There's a refugee flow going through Belarus to the border into Poland to get into the European Union. The European Union said that Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, is doing this to pay back the European Union for its attacks on him, claiming his election was illegal. And in reality, there's a high-level regime change operation underway in Belarus, run by the same people who did this against Ukraine. But even more so, they're blaming explicitly Putin for the crisis. Now, Putin's response is the refugee crisis has been caused by the interventions and wars conducted by the NATO powers. And he's also said that if you continue sanctions against countries like Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, and others, you're going to have more refugees because people are starving. People can't survive in these countries that have been ravaged by war and then are cut off from humanitarian aid. Putin and Merkel, the German chancellor who's still in, had a phone call yesterday, and Putin said that the European Union should restore relations with Belarus so they can talk to Lukashenko and his government instead of making accusations. So this comes as there is a continued effort for regime change in Belarus. Now, secondly, Secretary of State Anton Blinken met with the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Kuleba, and they signed a strategic partnership agreement on Wednesday. Now, what's in this is the usual bunk. They blame Russia for the conflict in eastern Ukraine, which is simply not the case. The conflict there stems from the fact that the Ukrainian government in Kiev refuses to abide by agreements they made in the Minsk talks and with the Normandy group. They refuse to give autonomy to eastern Ukraine and continue to shell them through the deployment of battalions that are filled with Nazis from the Ukrainian government who are against Russians, against Romanians, against all other ethnicities. The U.S. is supporting that. To argue that Russia is responsible for this is absurd. They've called for substantive measures to deter Russian aggression against Ukraine. And of course, we've had this news story that supposedly there are 90,000 Russian troops that are massed on the Ukrainian border. Remember last June? The same nonsense. Russia was conducting military maneuvers inside Russia, and the accusation was they're preparing to overrun Ukraine, the Baltics, and possibly even Germany. Now, the strategic partnership agreement also says Crimea must be returned. What Blinken said is, we are concerned by reports of unusual Russian military activity near Ukraine. 2 days ago, the Ukrainian Defense Ministry denied there was any unusual activity. Then obviously, after they got their arms twisted, they're now saying there is Russian activity. Kirby, the spokesman, said, we don't know what the Russian intentions are. Well, our Russian Defense Ministry official told us what their intentions are. He said, we're monitoring the escalated level of U.S. NATO activity in the Black Sea and in the airspace bordering Russia. If you remember in June 2021, June 24th in particular, there was a British provocation against Russian vessels that led to warning shots being fired, and the Brits backed down. The U.S. pulled back from sending ships into the Black Sea. But the line coming from Chatham House, which is British intelligence, is that Russia is preparing for action in Europe. A September 23rd report from Chatham House, What Deters Russia, said Moscow, quote, has abandoned restraint and embarked on an ever more damaging actions. Next week, there's a conference, Is Russia Weaponizing Gas? So the British are continuing to push this line. That's why our conference is so important, where we'll have representatives of Russia, of China, of many European countries, of Asian and African countries, to discuss how to avoid war, how to avoid poverty and starvation and chaos. The first panel in particular will be a counter to the war hawk propaganda around the topic, is there a pathway for peaceful, improved relations? That's why YouTube is trying to shut down our conference. But you can still get to it. You can get to it through the schillerinstitute.com, and I'd urge you to do that. Now, there are two questions I'm going to take up today, one of which is quite interesting. What are the implications of the November 3rd indictment of Igor Danchenko by Special Prosecutor John Durham? Well, this is an extra nail in the coffin of the Steele report, the Steele dossier, which is already buried deep down, even though people like Adam Schiff keep digging up the stinking remains of it and asserting that there is proof of Russian collusion. But what this confirms is there was a very high degree of responsibility of the Clinton campaign operatives in launching the whole Russiagate attack against President Trump upon his victory over Hillary Clinton in 2016. There's an indictment of the lawyer Sussman from the Perkins Coie law firm. That's the law firm which hired Fusion GPS, which hired Christopher Steele to write the lying report. The Danchenko indictment brings into focus someone named Charles Dolan, a longtime Clinton operative, who Danchenko said is the one responsible for the fake stories about Russian pressure, Russian blackmail on Donald Trump. So there's a lot more coming out that directly implicates key Clinton campaign and Clinton organization operatives. And former DNI John Ratcliffe says he expects more to come. But there are a couple of problems with this. Let me just point this out. First, one of the implications drawn by the press, the media, which of course is part of the problem, is that the FBI was duped, or was the FBI duped by the Clinton operation. But if you read the indictment and you read the reports that have come out, including in the Mueller report, it's clear that the FBI knew the whole Steele story was a lie. The FBI filings before the FISA court, which granted them a warrant to spy on the Trump campaign, were known to have been fake, that they knew that this was a fraud. People like Peter Strzok, his involvement in it, the FBI agent, FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe, who, by the way, just had his pension restored. These are people who were engaged in fraudulent operations on behalf of the FBI, working for the Clinton campaign. I mean, here's an interesting one. Sussman said he had no connection to the Clinton campaign, and yet while he was being interrogated by the FBI, which led to the charge against him that he was lying to the FBI, he was billing the Clinton campaign. So this exposes that the FBI knew this was going on, but let's ask a deeper question. What about the complicity in this, the culpability of James Comey, the FBI director, of John Brennan, the CIA director, of Clapper, the director of national intelligence, of the whole team of Obama operatives, including Susan Rice, who's now in a top position in the Biden administration? What about the role of Fiona Hill, who was an operative of the deep state for many, many years, including during the Trump administration, and she's one of the key witnesses in the Ukraine impeachment? Will they be brought up by Durham when there's tremendous evidence of their involvement in scripting the hoax and pushing the hoax to try to destroy the Trump administration in a form of regime change? Now, what are the role of the British? Sure, we know that Christopher Steele is a Brit, a top-level Russian hand from MI6. But what about before Steele? Hannigan of the GCHQ, who first called Brennan's attention to what he said was evidence of Russian cyber activity to influence the election. That was December 2015. What about Richard Dearloff, the former head of MI6, who was responsible for the fake Iraq weapons of mass destruction dossier used by Colin Powell. Dearlove vouched very highly for Christopher Steele in setting him up to work with the FBI. What about the open discussion among leading British circles of the need to stop Trump from the House of Lords? What about the Guardian's role? Luke Harding and others, Harding wrote a book called Collusion, which asserted nakedly that there was absolute proof of Russian-Trump cooperation, collusion. The Economist magazine and others. So will Durham get to this British role? And this is extremely important because, as I pointed out earlier, the British are still pushing an anti-Russian narrative which could put the United States in a war with Russia. So there's some promising developments around the Durham investigation. It's taking a long time. Will they push it ahead? Well, we have to make sure that we demand that there be full investigation, full release of classified documents, public release of classified documents. And I think when that happens, we'll see that the same regime change operation that's underway against Belarus, that was in the Ukraine and elsewhere, Libya, it was what was deployed in the United States. Now, a second question, and I'll take this up briefly, but it's an important one because I get it from a lot of people. The question is, why are we seeing a move by bankers to impose a communist reset? Is this run by the Chinese Communist Party? This is the kind of ideological problem that afflicts the American political discussion. There's the idea that you have left, right, liberals versus conservatives, communists, Nazis. These are all ideological positions which have very little to do with reality. The Great Reset is not a communist plan. It's run by bankers, the same bankers who, before World War II, were involved in supporting Soviet Russia. At the same time, they were putting Hitler in power in Germany. These are bankers who are part of a corporate cartel, global corporate cartel, that at the time, before World War II, included the steel industry, the rubber industry, oil and gas, the Rockefeller Trust. These were the trust agencies, including banks such as Union Bank Corporation of New York, which included the Harriman family and Prescott Bush, the father of George H.W. Bush. These are bankers who use left and right. They use communists and fascists. They use violent terrorists of the left and right to destabilize nations as part of their plan to undermine the sovereignty of nations and to establish a global order which is of, by, and for the bankers, not communists. This communist thing is a red herring. Do communists get involved in it? Sure they do. So do fascists. So do certain people who are racists and certain people who are just plain lunatics. But the impetus for this is coming from bankers who are seeing the systemic collapse of their system. They've run it into the ground. They've created a hyperinflation that's stealing money from every household, that's raising the prices you have to pay for heating, for transportation, for food, for medicine, putting the pocket in the hand and putting the money into the pockets of the billionaires. They're not communists. They are fascists. They are predatory capitalists, but they don't represent an effective American system approach. In fact, they attack the American system. So the idea that this is somehow a communist operation is designed to play on those people in the United States who still have a memory of the Cold War. The reality is that we've had one enemy in the whole history of America. It's the international oligarchy centered in the city of London, which, especially since the assassination of William McKinley, moved in and took over the United States through Wall Street, through J.P. Morgan, through the Chase Bank and the Rockefellers, through collaboration with the Rothschilds and other City of London operations. That's who's running the so-called deep state in the United States. It's not a communist operation. It may take the form, you may be hearing Klaus Schwab and others saying we're going to equalize everybody's income. Well, that's for the peons, for the peasants. Their actual intention is to kill you, to reduce the population, so that they can continue to run their system and run the world for themselves. So I would simply say that people who are assuming that the Chinese Communist Party is involved in this should take a look at China. China has billionaires, but what China also has is a program to lift people out of poverty and to start increasing the wages. That's part of the reason the deep state turned on China. That China ceased to be a source of cheap labor and cheap products for a globalized trade system and started moving to improve the conditions for their own people. And that was a no-no. That's where the anti-China stuff comes from. So be very careful of these profiles. And that's why it's important that people tune into the Schiller Institute webcast this weekend to get the latest update from the people who are making history. And you should become part of this movement that's making history instead of allowing the gossip being put out there by the oligarchs to shape your view of the world. So I hope you'll join me this weekend, schillerinstitute.com, and I'll be back again next week.